the goal of today's presentation, or the purpose of it, is to basically give you something that you can utilize for whatever it is you might be doing. Like Kathy was saying, whether it is trying to get a new bike path, or trying to get an ordinance changed in your community, or trying to elect someone alderman, say of a particular ward in the city of Chicago, for instance. But this plan is going to seem a little simplistic and basic, but the reality of it is, and I've run dozens of campaigns, even some successful ones, that if you actually do this 5 M's that I give you here when we actually get it on the screen, if I do it right, sorry. I want to go back to the first slide. Sorry, I bumped you up all the way back. One more. Nope, I guess there isn't a cover page. My apologies. The 5 M's, we will go through each one. And M's are words that start with the letter M. So it is pretty simple, like I said. If you put these 5 things together for whatever it is that you're doing, these 5 things together, you have a comprehensive campaign plan. Now, I don't want to tell you that it's that simple to run campaigns, but actually it is, because I've done it. And if I can do it, anybody can do it, trust me. So the whole point of us 3 doing this today is that I'm the grassroots expert, so to speak, here. And my goal in any client interaction is to basically build a crowd around an idea. So you're looking to do something, you might hire somebody like me to come in and say, okay, so where are the people? How do we get them excited about this? How do we get them to show up when we need them to show up? That's what the grassroots effort is that a lot of times my company will lead. Lissa's the PR pro here on the stage, and Heather actually runs the government affairs shop for the Chicago Cubs. Maybe you've heard of them. World champion Chicago Cubs, 2016. Yeah. So what we're going to do is each use basically an example from our own individual work. I'm going to stick with one example throughout and use it repeatedly on each of the different slides so that it has some consistency to it. And it takes a little bit of a setup, but one of my clients is a large suburb in the Chicago area, and they actually passed an ordinance several years ago which prohibited any home-based business. So that you could not operate anything for commercial gain out of a residential address. The zoning absolutely forbid it. It wasn't enforced for a number of years, but then at some point the commercial tenants in the town decided they wanted the town to enforce it, and they started to try to demand that the town enforce it. Strangely enough, the board that was elected to serve the town didn't want to touch it because they didn't want to upset the commercial tenants. So the actual people that ran the city, the village manager and the people that worked in the office for the city actually came out and hired me and said, I need you to build a group of upset citizens to come change this ordinance so that we don't have to enforce it. Because if we have to start enforcing it, people are going to move out of town, it's going to kill property values, et cetera. So that's the example that I'm going to use throughout this. So, and then Lissa will have her examples and Heather hers. But the first slide now, I apologize for jumping the gun on you back there, is messaging. And so this is your first M. And the M's can generally be in just about any order except for the last M, which always has to be last, and I'll cover that when we get to that slide. But when it comes to messaging, the important point for messaging from a grassroots standpoint is I need to make this relatable. So the most important thing that I do in messaging from a grassroots standpoint is to help you understand how this affects you. How does this affect you? And then the second thing I have to do with all of my messaging is to give you a sense of urgency on this, that something has to be done about this. And again, I'm oversimplifying messaging to an extent, and I'll let these ladies give you a more in-depth discussion of how they do messaging. But from a grassroots standpoint, it's pretty simple. We have to tell you something that you're going to pay attention to and have interest in, and then we have to be able to motivate you to do something based on that information. So that's what we do when we develop messaging. How about you, Lissa?
Well, messaging is, the most important thing about messaging is you have to control the message before someone controls it for you. So that's when we're talking about developing the message, and the messages are for different audiences too. So if, let's go to the bike path, and you want to create a bike path, you're going to have a message for the residents. You're going to have a message for the elected officials on why it's needed. Then you're going to have a message, if it's that big of a deal, to the media. And short, because everything is in 15 or 7-second sound bites these days. But you have different messages for different audiences. But if you don't manage the message, someone's going to manage it for you.
How about you, Heather?
Yeah, that's pretty much the same thing, and I rely heavily on folks like Lissa to help me craft the message so that because we have to choose our words wisely, right? Like she said, you have maybe like 10 words to get maybe a very important point across, so controlling the message is really important for us, and I have several statements that are just like my basic answers to any question. The number one being the safety and security of our fans in our ballpark is our number one priority. That's pretty much how I'll answer anything that you ask me. Is it raining outside? The safety and security of our fans is our number one priority. And that's actually very true. I mean, it's the truth, but sometimes like I can, with Wrigley Field, it can be a little bit complex with what we're doing over there. And it's easy for people, they're very emotional about things, and so it's very easy.
Cubs fans being emotional?
I know, it's so wild. It can be easy to get boxed into a corner, so I have to be able to like do.
So going back to my ordinance example, when we talk about messaging, the big message I needed to get across to people on that particular changed ordinance issue was that this affects your property values. And so we're obviously targeting homeowners with something like that. And we needed to talk about this before people started to talk about the other side on this stuff, and we needed to get out in front of it. And then the second thing we had to do is to make sure that people understood that this ordinance was being enforced. So, and the absurd thing about this ordinance was that it applied to every business. So it wasn't just people who were trying to run a landscaping business or a hair salon or a pet grooming facility out of their house. This was a 14-year-old kid who's mowing the neighbor's lawn for $10. This is the consultant that works for Ernst & Young and works 2 days a week from home that can't do that any longer. So, in terms of the messaging, we were able to say they may not have gotten you yet, but they will. And if they do, it's a cease and desist and it shuts down your business. You've got to move out. You've got a vacant house that you've got to sell, and you've got this very restrictive ordinance on it. So this is a pretty easy example. I'm giving you my, I'm mindful of that, but it's also an easy one to talk about. So moving on to the next M, measurement. This is where you assess the situation. This is where you take into account everything that you can take into account to develop your plan, your roadmap for how you're going to do what it is you want to do, whether it's win a political campaign, get your bike path in your community, or to get this ordinance changed to a more permissive and logical ordinance. And I have in here assumptions are your enemy, and that is actually something that I think is really important in this, because a lot of times when you start to do a business plan, they've always told you in business school, I assume, I'm a lawyer, so I know nothing about business, that you have a set of assumptions, and based off of those set of assumptions, then you build out your plan. That's not what you do in this situation. Right, because you would assume that no town would have an ordinance like this that prevents its citizens that live in their homes and purchase their homes from doing business there. Assumptions can work against you in this instance. So I am drawn toward focusing on lessons that you can learn from the past and reading on the present. When I'm running campaigns that have large budgets, I have the benefit of doing polling and doing focus groups and spending thousands of dollars on things like that. When you're trying to get an ordinance changed in a town that doesn't have any money to do it, and you have no budget, all you can do is look at, what are the lessons we can learn from the past? Who was on this board when this thing passed? Who are they close to? Who are their supporters and their opponents? Who gave money to those individuals that were on the board? That's a very important one. When this ordinance was passed. And now it's in front of this board, and the board's not willing to take action. Who's on this board currently, and who are they allied with? And then basically you're going to look at mapping your strategies then around your opponents or your supporters for this particular initiative. And you're going to navigate based on what you can learn from what's in the record. So we looked at who had testified at the hearings before, who was proposing this initiative from the beginning. And we found out that it was a large commercial landscaping business, a large commercial plumbing business, and a large commercial electrical contractor that were living in the village, had their companies in the village and wanted to prevent local plumbers, local electrical contractors, and local landscapers from parking their trucks in front of their house, operating out of their house, and not having to pay rent in a large business. That was what was keeping this ordinance from being righted. So we were able to learn all of that just by looking at past testimony, and then we figured out, which of these board members took money from these particular companies, and it was a pretty easy picture to draw from there. So measurement isn't always high-price polling and focus groups and those types of things. A lot of times it can be just what you can learn by looking at the landscape and then using that to create a roadmap to your desired outcome. What's your experience, Alyssa or Heather?
Well, nowadays, social media is key. And quite frankly, Facebook is key. Because there is so much information that you can find on a particular issue or sentiment. There's emotional listening now with social media, where you are literally reactive to keywords. And there is a company that is based in Chicago that works with professional teams, not the Cubs, where they test what their fans want to hear. And there's social reaction, social listening reaction, and they literally go back and tell the management or the key players that talk to the media, use these words or these phrases, and they are seeing 30 to 35% positive social media engagement because those key phrases or words are being used. So the point of the matter is, while John's digging through all the stuff and what I do when I'm on the dark side and working in crisis and trying to either kill an issue or exploit it, the social media component is so important that I spent 21 years as a journalist, and it pains me to say this, but social media is more important than traditional media.
And we're going to talk about that. Media happens to be one of the other M's, just as a preview, but we'll come to that too. Heather?
I think for me, especially in my role with managing our relationships in the neighborhood, I spend a lot of time in individual conversations, whether relationship building. Actually, I have a core coalition of people that I consider my local community stakeholders that I rely on a lot to let me know what they're hearing from their neighbors or what they're hearing at the parent drop-off at the local school, that kind of thing. I also spend a lot of time on social media reading about what our neighbors are saying about us, because there's a lot of little neighborhood Facebook groups where they just like to sling mud publicly, but on the internet. So that's pretty much what I do. And the only assumption that I ever make is for the worst case scenario. Sure. And so we, the Cubs, are present at probably about 100 community meetings a year. And so even after having done this for a long time, I over-prepare for every single meeting, anticipating what question could be asked or what someone is unhappy about, because then at the end of the day, I'm ready to go and they're never really a big deal. And I can usually, if someone's really unhappy about something, I can take them aside and have a private conversation with them without it blowing up in public.
So measurement can be, in Heather's case, sort of having this community group out there that she can use as a filter to say, I want to measure what response we're going to make on this based on what I'm getting from this group that I built, that you built, that says, hey, we're upset about these particular things. That's a form of measurement as well, where you don't necessarily, and you may still do it, but you don't have to go out and do a poll. You don't have to go out and do a focus group and bring people in and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. She just built her own network to be able to say, all right, I'm going to go to these people when I'm wondering how they feel about things. And that is an essential part of any campaign plan, no matter what the campaign plan is looking to do. So moving forward to now we got a quote before this, and I apologize. I pulled this quote when I did the first version of this presentation. It was probably 1998, so it's 20 years old. And now, the media has exploded in ways that, especially online, that we never could have envisioned at that time. But this quote reads, for those who aren't wearing their glasses, and I'm not wearing mine, so bear with me. People are always on the move, and they're consuming their media in many places, in many contexts. During the days of broadcast media, you could put an ad on TV and be pretty sure that most people would see it. Now you have to do a very multi-layered approach that makes sure that not only are you reaching each voter you care about, but you're reaching them in multiple ways. So our adage in certainly the political business, and I'm sure in Alyssa's business to an extent as well, was always 7 different times, 7 different ways. That's what it was beat into us over the years. You needed to reach every voter 7 different times and 7 different methods, whatever they were. Stupid things like yard signs and bumper stickers and all that stuff that has absolutely no value in my opinion, or TV ads, radio spots, or somebody knocked on their door, that type of thing. Now there are so many channels that are available to you, and the unfortunate part is now that we have all these channels, we actually have a shorter attention span for everybody out there that's consuming the media. So in terms of media, there are categories here in terms of what sort of we would call media under the 5 M's, and there are, and I'm going to come back to the first one last, and Liz has already referred to this a bit, but there's earned media. Does everybody understand what earned media is? Anybody here know what earned media is? That's where when Alyssa was at Channel 2 and I was a press aide at a Secretary of State's office here in Illinois, and I would go and I would beg her to cover my office holder. As I said before we started, I used to say, I don't even care if you have film in the camera because he's not going to watch it anyway. Just get a camera out there because I need a camera to be there, right?
And I pull people off lunch to go cover it.
Right. And that's earned media. And going back to my example on the ordinance issue, I was able to get a story in the Chicago Tribune, talking about the fact that they had this bizarre ordinance in this particular town, and that there was work being done on it. That is earned media, and the fact that it showed up in the Tribune means a lot more than just this guy who doesn't even live in this town showing up and telling you need to do something about this issue. If the Tribune cared about it and they wrote about it, it must be a legitimate issue. Regardless of what you think about the media. But in terms of earned media, there's television, there's radio, there's print, there are podcasts now, there are influencer posts, all kinds of things that are technically earned media. That's media that you're not paying to have done directly. And then there's paid media, which is media that you are paying for. And that would be your traditional radio ads, TV ads, digital ads that you see everywhere that you can't avoid, that follow you around, and signage, direct mail, all that type of stuff. That's all forms of paid media. And now you can also do something which I would call paid news. There are all kinds of sites out there that look to be like the Tribune or some other online newspaper, but you actually pay them money, and then they will print a story exactly as you want it on their site and make it look like a news story. So in situations like mine, if you weren't able to get the Tribune to cover it, you might resort to one of those paid stories, which doesn't cost very much, and then you're going to go back, and now as we go to the create your own, you're going to take that media and you're going to have it pushed out on your Facebook page and say, oh, look at this story from the Illinois Business Times or whatever, talking about our particular issue, and it gives credibility because it's not just John Pearman saying to read this or to care about this issue. It's somebody else gave me third-party, sort of third-hand recognition of our issue and how important it is. So, with creating your own media now, the keys are in your hand. We do something we call neighbor stacking in Grassroots, and that is where Lissa has a next-door neighbor, and she can talk to that neighbor, and then she finds out who else might care about it, who else might have a home-based business, or who else might be affected by this particular ordinance, and then that neighbor provides an introduction for Lissa to go out and talk to them about it as well, or carries the ball themselves. And at the same time, we're taking these people's social networks too, and taking their Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc., and having them communicate about this over and over again within their network and multiplying that network. And so in the town that I'm talking about where we did this ordinance issue, 80% of it was done just off of sort of word of mouth through individual networks and people knocking on their neighbors' doors. And I love things like that because that's real grassroots. It's a real thing. It's people talking to people. It's people using their own relationships and the people that they've built relationships with to move an issue forward. In terms of media, I think if you have the benefit of being able to use paid media, that's great. But most campaigns, and in particular this ordinance issue, we had zero budget. We didn't have money for anything. So we're not going to run TV ads on WGN. And we're certainly, we're lucky to get one Tribune story. Nobody else is going to come out and bring a camera and cover a local ordinance issue. Nobody wants to see that on the news. It takes away from the water skiing squirrel. The point is we had to create it ourselves. And I think that's largely, whether you're, hey, I only do email, well, there's a lot of people in your address book. How many of those people might care about this issue? And, so when we talk about media, it's not it's not just the people who stand in front of the camera. It's the people who sit behind the keyboard too.
So I have two quick anecdotal stories. Speaking of the news organizations that create themselves and they call themselves news, there is a real example of one of those organizations being quoted on the floor of Congress by a congressman saying, I told this blah, 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 reported this, and this is why it's so important. And he was holding up the story that ran from the organization that started itself. And I don't know if that makes sense, but it went all the way down to the floor of Congress. And so the client, not mine, another client friend was like, oh my God, the congressman just held up our own newspaper. And that's how far it got.
I'm scared right now that might have been one of my
No,
clients.
not this day.
The big reveal.
But the thing about the internet is, the beautiful thing about the internet is anyone can become an expert. The bad thing about the internet is anyone can become an expert. So when John's talking about self-publication, that's exactly what it is. There's a company that's based in Illinois. They have 19 newspapers in Illinois, online newspapers, and they have about 190 across the country. And that looks like news, but it's their own news that they're pushing out, but it looks like news. It
That people
absolutely
pay
does.
them for. Yeah.
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 There's small subscription services. Some of them are free too. But that's the thing is, and this whole thing with reading the internet and Twitter and everyone's heads are down these days, people gravitate to what they want to read or hear. And one of the best things that you can do in the political world that I work in, I call myself purple. I work with Republicans and Democrats. I'm not partisan. And one of the most difficult things you have to do is read something that you don't agree with to get a different perspective.
Absolutely.
To learn. And so when you're talking about creating your own network, again, we always gravitate to the comfortable, but read something you don't like, and then that's how you use the internet and everyone's an expert to just kind of wrap your head around what's going on in the world.
What's your experience, Heather?
So first of all, I like that expression, neighbor stacking. I like that a lot. And that kind of goes back to what one of the other presenters was talking about this morning is when you have to ask people to help you. Like, what can you do for me? I have to do a lot of that. And it is like, I need to meet 5 people on your block. Can you help me do that or whatnot? But with media and the internet in particular, is the spread of misinformation and trying to overcome that. People hear bits and pieces and then they process it their way and then they spit it back out, and trying to overcome the not real news or the less facts news. And just like the alternative facts news, and just like making sure that the right information is out there, because like in our experience with the Cubs and us trying to do our development around Wrigley Field, which I think a lot of you are going to see later tonight if you're coming to Billy Joel, there was a lot of misinformation spread, and there still is, about what we're doing and how we're doing it and what our intentions are. And that is really, it makes our job more difficult as we build our credibility. And so making sure so you could see how this is all tying together. So it's just back to like always being on message, always saying the same thing over and over again, not straying, knowing who your audience is and maybe the nuances where you may change things, but just like staying the course, really.
And Heather mentioned a very important word, fact. Have to stick to the facts. Mm-hmm. And the facts are what matters at the end of the day. And I don't know how many lawyers are in the audience, and I'm not one, but I play one on TV. Truth is the best defense. So if you stick to your facts, and you have to correct facts. Don't be afraid to go out there and correct misinformation, because that's crucial. Once you get that wildfire going, it's hard to put out.
Yeah, that's an important point. Earned media is very different for Heather than it is for me. I'm fighting to try to get a story on something that nobody generally cares about, right? She's trying to keep stories from being written. Yeah, right.
That's always like every
time. And I'm in the middle.
Every time I leave the front office, my boss and our VP of communications say, I'm not even kidding you, do not end up on the front page of the Sun-Times. Like that is like my constant order.
Yeah, it's tricky.
It's true.
So we are on to our fourth M, and I know we're probably behind on time here a little bit. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this one because it's relatively self-explanatory, and that's money. Yeah, in the political campaign world, those that spend the most win the most. It's a fact. I can show you study after study after study. I think you probably know that yourself anyway, and it might be a little disheartening to people. But in the example that I'm bringing you today, this local ordinance issue, we did it for zero money. I ended up spending $8,500 total on this, and it was donated from people who supported the cause. So we spent $5,000 on Facebook ads to try to build our audience and make more people aware of it and educate them on the facts. And we spent $3,500 on printing of flyers with talking points on it that then we had neighbors walk, door to door on this stuff, knock on their neighbor's door and say, hey, just in case you didn't know, and you may not have a business in your house, but it's going to be really hard to sell your house ever if you want to because of this ordinance. So it didn't take any money to do something like that. It just took the credibility of the people that were doing the talking and the communicating on this. And somebody like me doesn't have to have any credibility if I can leverage the credibility of the right people within the community. And that's exactly what we did. And the more comprehensive campaigns are going to have other things to them. But the most important thing is that before you spend a penny, before you do anything along those lines, is that you think about who's putting the strategy together. What's the plan? And until you have a plan, don't spend any money. And that, a lot of times, whether it's an architect like me or whether it's Lissa coming in to help you manage something like this, I think it's a good idea to go out and get that level of advice before you start what you're doing and before you spend any money, and then figure out how you can spend the least of it. And just as a guide, the best campaigns in the world, 3 out of every $4 that they spend are spent on paid media these days. So, if you're paying people to do things that aren't showing up in tangible ways that people who can be influenced on this issue can see, you shouldn't be spending it. That's my opinion.
And also of that paid media, about 25% of that should be social media. So if you have a $1,000 budget, take 25% of that and put it into paid social media, because nowadays, if I were to ask this audience, how many of you go to LinkedIn first thing in the morning? 4 of you are going to raise your hand. How many of you go to Facebook first thing in the morning? How many of you go to Twitter first thing in the morning? Many of you are creeping on your daughter's Instagram first thing in the morning. Guilty. But the point is, there's so much out there that you literally, as John alluded to earlier, you have to blanket everything because you never know who's going to want to see what first, where they're going to get their information from.
Anything to add on the money aspect of it? Where do the Cubs spend their money?
On the field.
Payroll.
We actually have a great social media presence, actually. #1 in MLB, I believe. It's won a lot of awards, especially coming out of the World Series. That year in 2016, we had billions of impressions around the globe. So we do spend a lot of money on advertising, but we really wrangle the social media as well.
Yeah, you do a great job. You're #1 as far as I'm concerned. My wife, the Brewers fan who's out there, she'll maybe argue for her Brewers, but I'm with the Cubs all the way.
Me too.
A quote to take us into our last and fifth M is, there can be no transforming of darkness into light and of apathy into movement without emotion. And that takes us to the last slide, which is motivation. And motivation from a campaign standpoint for me, and when I present this presentation, it's usually a much longer one, so I apologize, you're getting the abbreviated form. Maybe you're happy about that, is that campaigns are all a one-day sale. You are trying to motivate everybody you have up to that one point, and it's a one-day sale, and you got to get them in your store. And you're only open between certain hours on this particular one day in this one location. And it happens every 4 years, essentially, or 2 if you're running on a 2-year cycle, or 6 if you're a U.S. senator. But the reality is that you're doing this one-day sale, and that your only opponent in the world out there, your only competitor, is running a one-day sale too, and it's the same day as yours, and it's in the same location as yours. And you got to figure out a way to get more people into your store than theirs. So that's what the motivation is. It's very, very obvious, and the urgency is there. So what we did in this particular suburb to try to get people motivated on this is we said, I'm going to get this on the agenda for a village board meeting, and they're going to have to deal with it, and we're going to pack that room with as many people as we can and force them to take up the issue. We had 50 people sign in to testify on behalf of our issue. By the time the third person had testified, the board cut off debate and said, we're going to table this. They came back 2 weeks later and passed an ordinance that took all of the restrictions out. So it was highly successful just because it was obvious and people should take action on it, but that doesn't mean that action necessarily happens just because it should. We had to take every stage of this 5 M's and run them all the way through. Motivation is always last, because you are moving toward that crescendo, that high point, that decision point on this. And unlike the one-day sale in campaigns and elections, if you're doing something to get a bike path or you're doing something for your community, there may be other decision points along the way. You may have multiples, but there is generally one point where this either gets a green light or it gets a red light. And so I think if you do those first 4 leading up to this 5th one, you're going to have highly motivated people to go out and take the action you're looking for them to take.
The way you win a political campaign or any issue campaign is you get those that are already in favor of it to act. And that's the hardest thing. Forget about trying to convince your neighbor who you like blue and they like red. You're not going to change their mind. But if the first thing you do is you get those that agree with you, make sure they voice their agreement. So whether it's social media or they actually go and vote. Then spend your time on the middle of the road people. Like you think you can get them, you're going to try, or you're looking for new people that would be interested, that John was alluding to earlier. But the number one thing is making sure that those that are with you act.
Yeah, I was going to say, make the plan, stick to the plan. It's not without a lot of work. It's a one-day sale, but it takes a lot of work. It's just executing the strategy, and the vocal supporters are tough to motivate, but get them on board early, make them the champions of the cause or the candidate, and they'll lead the way.
Great. Do we have any time for questions? I assume we might be a little over time here. We're out? All right. Thank you very much.